to you. I'm Michelle Eve, and welcome to the 4th episode of the Mystical Times blog podcast, which is about spooky and strange happenings in the beautiful county of Wiltshire. These first two experiences were told to author Kathleen Wiltshire for her book Ghosts and Legends of the Wiltshire Countryside. The first experience was on Walker's Hill in Wiltshire, where a Miss Muriel Coburn told of her spooky experience there in the summer of 1965. She was walking back from the long barrow that's above the White Horse and was heading towards the lay-by where she had parked her car. This was at the top of the hill. She had walked around 50 yards towards the long barrow when a sense of unease came upon her. She glanced around, looking towards the sky. She felt the air had turned cold, yet the sheep in the fields were acting in their normal way. This gave her a sense of normality, so she carried on walking towards where her car was parked. All of a sudden, she heard a distinct sound of horses' hooves, as though there were very many horses, all galloping. She then quickened her speed, as she felt she was in danger of being trampled upon by these unseen horses. It was as she passed the long barrow that the noise of the horses' hooves just stopped. There were no horses to be seen at all. Another person Kathleen Wiltshire spoke to was a local shepherd who kept his flock of sheep on Sher Hill Down. There is an old Roman road by there which runs through the Avebury Camp Hill Fort, which also leads to Silbury Hill, so there's lots of history in this small area. The shepherd said he had seen lots of men marching and that they had uniform on, which included wearing skirts, and said they all had beards and worn helmets, some of which had some sort of hair protruding through the helmets, so I'm guessing it was like a mohawk. And he added that they had a bird on some sort of pole. The author added that she would assume the bird was an eagle, an ornamental, rather than a live one. So what did these two people experience? A herd of horses, unseen yet heard, and what could be described as a unit of Roman soldiers marching on an old Roman road. Both these areas have a long history, and it seems as though, for some, its history comes alive. Now for a personal spooky experience I had in Wiltshire. The Church of St. Michael's and All Angels is in the market town of Highworth in Wiltshire, and there's been many a time that I've been in a traffic queue at the traffic lights, so had the chance to look towards the church building and graveyard. I've always felt a presence there. It was on the last two occasions that I actually saw a figure, which looked male in stature, although it had no features, and it was darting around the headstones. It looked similar to a shadow, but a shadow made of metal filings, as the movements of it were fluid, yet it kind of stayed together, but the hands and arms were slower to catch up with the main part. Whilst I've been researching spooky experiences for my website, I thought I'd look up the church to see if it had a history of anything paranormal being seen, and it has. It was in 1907, on the morning of Friday the 5th of April, when a young man called J. Graham Arkle was in the church. He had his 15-year-old younger brother, his 18-year-old sister, and her friend who was also 18, and her name was Miss Ludlow. They were all gathered around the church organ, with one of them playing the organ, and all were singing, when Miss Ludlow, with a raised voice, said, "Oh, look! Whatever is that?" As they turned around to where Miss Ludlow was staring, they all saw a figure of a man standing by the church door and leaning in as though to hear the singing more clearly. All of these witnesses described how the face of the figure had a featureless grey blank look to it, but more disturbingly, where the eyes should have been, there were sunken, dark shadows. According to J. Graham Arkle, the others turned away in fright, but he kept staring at the figure. He said the figure went over to the pillar and hid behind it, but the movement of its arms were very jerky, and then it just disappeared. There had been one other person in the church at this time, and she had been decorating the font just by the door in which this figure had been seen. This person had seen nothing. It was 11:30 a.m. on a bright sunny April morning, and the doors had been open, letting sunlight into the church, so the figure couldn't have been confused with a person walking into the building. The Society of Psychical Research took a statement from all those who had experienced this figure, less than a week of it happening, and all witnesses signed the statement made. J. Graham Arkle said his statement didn't give the intensity of the experience that was had by all. It was 30 years later, in 1938, that J. Graham Arkle confirmed the accuracy of his statement, and the then local vicar of when the incident happened commented that if this had been a hoax, the lady decorating the church at the time would not have been in on it. It was in 1936 when Mr. Ivor Hawkins, a verger of the church, also saw an apparition inside the building. It was in September, and it was around 7:45 p.m. He said he had unlocked the church for the session of the choir practice that was to be held at 8 p.m. As he turned round to close the door, he saw a figure coming up the centre aisle, and it went through some curtains near the west end of the door. It didn't part the curtains, it just seemed to walk straight through them. Mr. Hawkins said he hadn't yet turned the lights on in the church, but there were outside street lights, which gave the building a low light. He was unable to make out any features, but he did say the figure was of medium height and dressed in a long white robe of sorts. He also mentions there was no noise coming from the figure, and that it appeared to glide along rather than have the motion of walking. There have been other reports of a phantom figure that's seen in the churchyard. Witnesses have stated that the figure moves from one window to the next, peering in, then rushing off, as though it was trying to see something in the church, but unable to enter the building. Others have said it has no face, just two dark patches where the eyes should be. One witness described the figure's face as resembling a large pile of dust from a vacuum cleaner. And now for the final Wiltshire spooky experience. Was it a time slip or a ghostly encounter? It was a rainy October evening in 1916 when Edith Olivier was travelling from Devizes to Swindon in Wiltshire. Edith was said to have felt a little tired and wanted to find an inn where she could rest for a while, then continue her journey. She drove off the main road and found herself driving down an avenue which had huge megalithic upright stones. She realised she was in Avebury, where large stone megaliths were abundant. As she drove nearer to the centre of Avebury, she decided to pull her car over and look at these stones. She had never been to Avebury before, but recognised the scenery from photos she had previously seen. She stood on the high banks and could see little cottages nearby. It was then she spotted, in between the stones, lots of people attending what seemed to be a fair. The people held flares and torches whilst they enjoyed the stalls and games at the fair. She was very surprised to see no one was wearing outer garments, despite the rain falling quite hard. She could hear the crowd shouting and laughing whilst they were being entertained by the various performers. The rainfall would become heavier, and it was then that Edith returned to her vehicle to resume her journey. Edith wasn't to visit Avebury for another 9 years. On her return, she purchased a guidebook to Avebury, and to her surprise, read that the last time Avebury had a fair was in 1850. She told a local guide what happened to her 9 years earlier, but only to be told she was incorrect and that 1850 was the last year it had been held, so she must have been mistaken. Feeling quite perturbed by what she had heard from the local guide, she told them of how she got to where the fair was being held, an avenue of tall, upstanding megaliths, but astonishingly, she was told that this particular avenue had actually disappeared before 1800. So just what had Edith experienced? Was it a time slip or just some ghostly experience? If it was just a ghostly experience, why would she have seen the upright megaliths? It's a very interesting account indeed. That's all for this episode. I do hope you enjoyed these spooky tales from Wiltshire. And don't forget, if you've had a spooky encounter in or near to Gloucestershire, I'd love to hear about it. You can contact me at mysticaltimesblog@gmail.com. The next episode, I'll be talking about some very haunted places in my hometown of Tewkesbury. Till next time.